Hey, hello everyone, welcome. While we're waiting for folks to log in, I'm asking everyone to type into the chat box where you are right now geographically and what's one word to describe what you're feeling as it relates to this webinar. So we have Connecticut, Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, Chicago, this is great. LA. We've got excited, interested. We're going to wait for another minute or so before we actually start. Did I see Peru? That's pretty awesome. We've got hopeful, anxious. All right, why don't we begin? So again, welcome, Happy New Year. I'm Nicole Anderson, and I oversee Alumni Career Services at Tufts, both in the Tufts Career Center and in the Office of Alumni Engagement. Welcome to today's webinar, Job Search Success Secrets, featuring Leslie Warner from Alumni Career Services. We have two main goals in Tufts Alumni Career Services: to present programs like this, including webinars and networking events and other events across the country for all alumni, all schools. So please check the Alumni and Friends calendar, and I'll drop that link into the chat during our event. Our second goal is to foster connections between alumni and students. Alumni and students can check out their school's career center on the link that I'll also drop into the chat. And now for today's webinar. We'll be presenting for about 50 minutes. We will try our best to address your questions during the session. So if you want to type those into the chat box, I'll mention those to Leslie. And we will also save 10 minutes at the end to do some Q&A. We are recording this webinar, and it's going to be posted on our YouTube playlist. And I'll drop that link into the chat. And before we introduce Leslie, I want to acknowledge that the Office of Alumni Engagement has a community values statement, and I'll read that now and also post that. Our mission invokes an environment of mutual respect, free expression, and inquiry. Program participants accept these principles when they join this community and this space. In doing so, they agree to abide by the following community values. Number one, respect for the rights, differences, experiences, and dignity of others. Number two is express our viewpoints in a thoughtful and respectful manner. Number three, honesty and integrity, and in working with all members of the community. And number four, accountability for personal behavior. So let me introduce our presenter. Leslie Warner is an assistant director in Alumni Career Services. With an undergraduate degree in English and a master's in counseling psychology, Leslie has had a variety of jobs, including helping staff at an Army base that was closing and people affected by layoffs. She learned the other side of hiring through her work as a recruiter in human resources. At Tufts, she helps alumni of all career stages manage their careers, including job search, on-the-job success, graduate school application, and overall finding meaning and purpose at any age. She meets one-on-one with alumni from the Schools of Arts and Sciences, Engineering, and the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. And she also enjoys designing and leading workshops and webinars like this one. She especially loves helping others learn strategies they can use throughout their lives. So now I will hand the presentation over to Leslie.
Thank you, Nicole. And she mentioned our YouTube playlist, and I just want to highlight that a little bit. There are all the past webinars on job search topics and also career management and leadership topics are recorded and available there. And you might find some of those helpful as well. So what I will say is there are so many things that either I've learned in the past about job search and what's helped people, and then new things that come along that I add, that this PowerPoint is now a little bit long. It's wordy. It's more like a booklet. So don't expect a visual PowerPoint, expect a booklet with some ideas that I won't have time to go into in detail, but I'll reference and I'll point to them in the PowerPoint. You can always go back later for the detail. Um, and also there are resources at the end to dig into some of the topics more deeply. And again, we'll be paying attention to the questions in the chat to go a little more deeply in areas that you have questions. So welcome. You will see that the secrets are not actually super secret. I didn't invent them. It's more pulling together the wisdom of job seekers and folks that have been working with them for many years. So our agenda, how the job search is and isn't different today compared to times in the past. How do you prepare for a job search? The 4 main job search method buckets, some tips for effective search, and then, as I said, lots of resources at the end, because I just can't resist putting in everything that might be helpful. So how is it different or not different? Well, in the past and now, hiring patterns vary by industry and job function, and some companies may be recruiting very broadly. Others may be laying off in some divisions and hiring in others, or laying off in some roles and hiring in others. If you read about companies laying off in the news, or you look at the lists, you can see, you don't need to be too discouraged by that. You don't want to only target companies that are doing a lot of layoffs, but it's okay to have them as part of your targets, because they may be, you can research and learn that they may be hiring in other areas or departments. One thing that hasn't changed, you still need a resume, a targeted, focused cover letter, at least in most industries and most situations, and strong interviewing skills, the ability to talk to people, listen, chew gum, well, no, not chew gum, but to talk and listen and communicate about your job experience. One thing, I say visibility continues to be important, but I'd say that's the biggest change that I see over the arc of my career. It's partly because social media is here, but it's also being known, being seen is really, really important. And that can be through professional association, volunteering, writing in your field, being on LinkedIn and other social media, but that's continuing to be very important. Artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, that's a change. And I'll mention it a few times during the presentation of ways that it might be useful in particular situations. But it's also, since it is emerging, I'll put articles and resources at the end about ChatGPT in job search and career management. But you'll also want to check for fresh resources, because it is changing and people are learning more and refining tools every day. And something that's always been true, but I feel like just with the stress of day-to-day life and the pace of day-to-day life, self-care, mindset, and building relationships through networking is more important than ever now. So job search support, that's you one support, as Nicole said, for Art Sciences and Engineering, School of Music and Fine Arts. You have us as one support, our recorded resources, website. You can check with your school you graduated from for resources for career that they may have. Then to support your job search, you need to set up systems that are going to organize your space and your information in a way that will work for you. And what I mean by that is it's not ideal to be spread out on the dining room table with your job search and then having to clear it off every day. Ideal is to have like a dedicated space, physical space, as well as computer ways to organize your information. Talk to your friends about how they can support your job search. This is super important for a full-time search when you're not working and job searching full-time, but it's important in other settings too. Some people in your personal friend network may be really good at emotional support, reminding you that you have skills, reminding you that you can be good at this, that you can find that next role. Some people may be really good at tactical support, how to do something, helping you find a resource. A job search success team or buddy, that's something you can Google to find more details on, but basically it's an action team that meets once a week, typically to go over what were the action items you committed to, what were the action items your buddy or team person committed to, and how did that go? Not therapy, but accountability. It's really an accountability team. And research has shown and experience has shown that that can be very, very helpful for doing any challenging new thing in your life, but job search being one. Being your own project manager. That means don't just sit down and do the job search when you have the time or daily if you're in a full-time search. You want to once a week, at least this is one recommended way to do it, once a week, sit down with yourself and evaluate how did the past week go in your job search? What was your action plan? What were you specifically planning to do, hoping to do? How did those things go? What got in the way? Not to be hard on yourself, but to acknowledge what's working, what isn't working, and where you might need more input, more resource, more information. Now, building resilience. This is one of those areas that is so crucial for when you're in a full-time search, but is also important when you're working and job searching at the same time, right? Resilience just means your ability to recover, bounce back from challenge or difficulty. There are proven ways to increase your resilience: exercising, yoga, dance, some form of body movement that works for you. Try something new if you've never done anything in terms of exercise or yoga. Mindfulness, there's many different methods of meditation, of stress reduction, and I have lots of resources that I share here, because what I encourage people to do is, if you've never done anything like that before, try some different methods, try some different approaches. Some involve moving your body while meditating, some involve sitting still and just breathing with some instruction, some guidance about how to breathe. Again, proven by research it's not proven by research to magically help your job search, but it is proven to reduce stress and help you focus. Mindset, very important. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Yeah. Mindset is the story you're telling yourself in your head. And you can't control all the voices in your head, but you can influence them. And one way to think about mindset is the difference between, oh, the job search is too hard, there's nothing out there, versus saying to yourself, and even writing down, my target company isn't hiring now or isn't hiring yet. I can connect with people in my industry, learn about trends, identify skills I could be working on now, brainstorm with such and such person about other companies, other industries, other job functions that I could target. So you see the difference, acknowledging those voices or those concerns in your head, but then looking for what's a way that you can shift your mindset to have some control. And the word yet is sometimes helpful. I don't have a contact at that company yet. And then it's, what actions can you take? Here's another quick examples. This is impossible versus I've met challenges before. What strategies did I use back then? Could those strategies help here? Another way people ask that is, what did I learn from meeting a past challenge? And how can I apply those learnings now? Taking mindfulness breaks, which can literally be a walk around the block, or that one of those breathing exercises that are just very easy. You can find them easily. So shifting to preparing for your search in more tactical ways, you need to have what we call your public statement. Why did you leave your job, or why do you want to leave your job? And if you are between jobs, what are you doing now lately? And the public statement means this is what you say to somebody that's not inner circle, close friend, relative, right? The inner circle, close friend, relative, for example, if you've been laid off or you had a difficult transition leaving your job, that inner circle is where you share the emotions, the ups and downs. Anybody not in that inner circle, you need a scripted, edited version. So for example, if it's a layoff situation, it's, my company, along with many others in my industry, was affected by revenue downturn in recent quarters, and my department, along with others, was affected, and now I'm looking at such and such, right? Something truthful, brief. You can even be briefer than that if you're just running into someone in the post office. And keeping those gnarly emotions out of it if you have them, but working with those emotions and expressing them with your inner circle of support. The other thing that's super helpful that people often skip in preparing for a search is really doing a self-assessment. What are my skills? What are my goals? What are my needs? What am I looking for now? And what do I have to offer? And really taking a pause to be a bit thoughtful about that is very helpful. It helps you have a more focused search. The other thing that's helpful, both preparing for the search and during the search, is research tools. And here I want to do a real shout out to, you can find a lot on the internet, but the professional journals, trade association journals, industry magazines are usually not free out on the internet. Sometimes you can find things free, but they're often not. And you can get them free at your public library, which will be the full text business and trade press database. Speak to the reference librarian briefly if you aren't sure which online resource is the one for these full text articles and databases. Just a minute, I'm remembering to turn off my phone just to be sure it doesn't interrupt us. And also it's available through, right, Nicole? It's through the Tufts online community, which is basically a database of alumni, but it's also a firewall protecting some resources, including a library research database of these full text business and trade press articles. But you'll come back to that for prepping for interviews and other aspects of your search. So before we jump into the next slide, do I have questions, Nicole, that have come up so far?
So one question that we have from Susan is, what self-assessments do you recommend? Are there any free ones out there that are good?
Great question. Yes, at least in the past, and I haven't checked recently, but there was a pretty good free skills assessment available through the one-stop career centers. Mm-hmm. So you would Google One Stop Career Center. It's a federal national system, but then administered through the states. And then you look to see what assessments they have. You can also find some assessments on our website, the Tufts Career Center website, right, in different topic areas.
I'll drop those into the chat. I'll drop links into the chat.
Thank you. So, yeah, we talked about that. Any other questions so far?
Okay. Nope, but Chelsea gives us a good example of one that she took recently called the Standout Assessment. Mm-hmm. So folks can check that out. I'm not familiar with that.
Yep. Next step, defining your target job. These are suggested categories: type of company, industry, location or commute, management style, company culture, and super important, the skills you're going to use, the major job functions, the problems you want to work on, advancement, learning, compensation, benefits, and additional criteria that may be super important to you. So for example, I've had people working in certain nonprofit or mission-driven organizations who've talked with me about how it's not just that the organization have an environmental mission, it's about how the exact tactics and philosophy and politics and approach was very important to them. At one point, I was working with one person, his restrictions around that were so tight. He said there were 3 nonprofits in Washington, D.C. that fit his criteria for tactics, approach, politics around the environment. And I said, well, that's okay. It's just, that's a very short list of organizations. And, they might not need you right now in your time frame. So we have to talk about how to broaden your list if you need to. He did end up landing an internship, a paid internship that was good for him at one of his 3 places, but you can imagine that's a little small. Create your target organization list, like my young friend who had 3, okay, which is definitely not enough. Even 3 big companies, right, doesn't guarantee that they'll have the right need in your time frame. I say 20 to 25 that meet your criteria. That's arbitrary. If they're smaller, you definitely need more than 25. And it's whatever, again, whatever seems to meet your criteria. You notice I haven't mentioned whether they're advertising yet, right? That's a separate question. This is your target list. How do you find out what companies should be on it? Some of it will be these library resources. There's a publication called Boston Business Journal, Chicago Business Journal. It's in many, many cities in America, all the major cities. And the Business Journal publishes a book of lists. And the book of lists is the largest, top 25 largest hospitals in Chicago, largest PR firms. So it's not evaluating them by your criteria, but it is a way to start generating lists. Also, asking other people working in your target industry, show them your company list, your target list, saying what other companies should I be looking at based on what I'm looking for. Now, the searchable business company database. This is different from the article database. The article database is usually full text business and trade press articles, something like that. The business company database is just a list of companies, but it's searchable by a lot of different criteria: location, size, but they're organized by keyword of the description or by the product or service they're providing. Again, public libraries often have that, and you can find it there, and it's super helpful for just identifying what exists, what's out there. Now, ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, can help you generate company lists, but just a caution here. Again, it's not perfect information. It's looking at what it finds on the internet using your prompt questions, like, can you give me a list of the largest PR firms in the Cincinnati area serving the healthcare industry, right? And ChatGPT will give you a list, but I also recommend that you use some of these other methods as well. It's not perfect. So why are these target company and target job lists so important? Well, you've caught hints about this all along as I've been talking, right? Because I'm talking about things that can, let's get that. Yeah, things that can focus your time, energy, and effort, which helps make your job search more efficient. And it increases your chances of getting a job that fits you. Just sitting down and defining your criteria as best you can, what you think you're looking for, what you think will be a good fit for you, already helps increase the chances when you're defining what you're looking for, you're more likely to notice it or see it. And you can communicate it clearly to other people. Here's what I'm looking for. Here's what I'm hoping for, right? And it helps you make thoughtful trade-offs and compromises when necessary. And helps you maintain some motivation and control. You can be proactive and not just reacting to things out there that are advertised, although you're allowed to apply. We'll talk about that as well. Think of yourself as a sort of paradigm shift, that you're a one-person marketing and sales firm. Of course, nobody wants to be that forever, or most of us don't, but you're bringing what you're marketing and selling is your skills, your ability to solve a problem or get something done for this company, for this organization. And some of what we're talking about here is going to be market research and market, exploration. Okay, yeah, before we jump into preparing the marketing documents, any additional questions, Nicole?
No, we don't. I'll scroll through again, but, oh, wait. Okay, so we have someone's writes, I struggle with putting together a target list of employers because they tend to be really large employers that I can never get first round interviews with because they are also the most desirable and competitive. Do you have any suggestions for gathering information on small employers who do not have much publicly accessible information?
Okay, great question. And here's where it will depend. Let's, if it's in a specific industry, then one option is when you identify even one of those small companies and pull that page, that company page up on LinkedIn, and you'll see to the right, people also viewed. Some of them will be competitors. Another way is that business company database, right? So if you're looking for, say, medical device companies, you can look for those in the business company research database that the public libraries have, and you're searching by keyword. And there's even something called a standard industrial code that the government does, where once you know the code number for the industry that you're looking for, you can search by that as well as location. Those are a couple of ways. You can also ask ChatGPT, can you give me smaller parenthesis, 500, 50 to 500 employees, or whatever you define small as, company in the such and such area or in such and such industry, right? Do you have other thoughts, Nicole, or ways to generate company lists?
I'll throw some ideas into the chat.
Okay. And so there's databases, again, where you can reach it. And additionally, if you're reading trend articles, business trend articles in a trade publication in your industry or your job function, that can be another interesting resource too. Good question. And the other, and again, once you're networking with people in your target industry, you're also asking them, who has a good reputation and is, companies you've heard of in this. So preparing marketing documents, your resume, your cover letter, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because we do have webinars recorded on these topics and information on our website as well. But the idea is, even in the modern, digital age, you still need a resume that really targets your target industry, your target job function. JobScan is an online resource where you can plug your resume in one side, plug the job ad in on the other side, and it tells you how good of a match you are with the language that you're using and what's on your resume. Cover letter, ideally customization for each job, so that you can focus on their business challenge and their specific needs. ChatGPT, you can definitely use to help you with a first draft, but I'm not a huge fan because it doesn't sound like a person wrote it. You do need to sound like a person. So using ChatGPT to check for that match, that marketing match, that language match, that's helpful. Some people, if you're really having a block about writing something, then use ChatGPT to get at least a first draft, but it's got to have a human voice. One thing these days, and certainly in the last 10, 15 years or so, you definitely need a LinkedIn profile, pretty much most industries, most job functions, so that you can communicate, again, what you do, what you can do, what's your brand, how do you do your work, as well as the skills that you do it with. And then also you'll be using LinkedIn, not just as marketing, but to reach out and connect with people. That's more on the networking side. And again, we have webinars covering these documents, these topics.
We do have a question, Leslie, if I can interject. Jack asks, how necessary is the cover letter these days? Is there a way to tell when it might be read versus not?
That is such a great question. And I once had, this is so great, right? As a workshop presenter, you never know. I had a third party, headhunter recruiter in one of my workshops once, and she said, we never read the cover letter. And she didn't have time, right? And she wasn't recruiting at super senior levels. It was more professional levels, but not very senior level. On the other hand, I have managers who tell me they read the scan the resume, that few seconds of human reading to see, is this a document I want to read further? Am I interested? If they are interested, then they also read the cover letter. But the bottom line answer is networking and talking to people inside the company to ask that question. I've certainly heard of people in technical fields, certain types of engineering, who say their company doesn't read cover letters and doesn't need them. And I've also heard of tech companies and engineering firms that do. So unfortunately, there's no one size fits all rule. Is that your experience too, Nicole, or do you have another nuance to add?
Um, I think it depends on the field, really.
Mhm.
I think if it's something in a STEM field or something that has highly technical skills, I think they're going to go right to the resume.
Mhm.
But I do think I say cover letter every time. Jack asked a follow-up question, is the cover letter more about content or intent? In other words, effort put forth.
Yeah.
I think it's about both.
Mhm.
But I think that a cover letter is not simply about repeating what's on your resume. It's about saying why you want to
Right.
apply for the position and the organization. And a lot of people don't put that in, and they
Right.
can tell then that your cover letter is kind of a form cover letter.
Right.
So
Right. Why you're aligned with their mission, why you're a match for them. And yes, and it's absolutely right that some technical companies don't read them for professional level positions that aren't senior executives. But it is an opportunity to tell your story your way, with solid content that shows how you can solve their problem, how you can address their pain point, whatever. Great questions. So marketing presentation, this is more talking, being able to talk, being able to introduce yourself in a networking situation, like an informational interview, answering these questions. Who are you? What are you best at? What do you want them to know about you right now? For an interview, it's more in the format of tell me about yourself. Could be 90 seconds, could be 2 minutes, customized for every situation, every interview. How to answer that tell me about yourself, you can find terrific articles and videos online, as well as my interviewing webinar to talk more about that. The interview stories, some of them are going to be your stories describing key accomplishments, right? Challenge, action, results, or situation or task, actions, results. Not everything is a challenge or a problem. That's just the format for how you set up the story and making sure that it has a solid, clear ending. That's another, common mistake is people knowing what their interview story is, but maybe they haven't practiced it out loud. Maybe they even wrote some notes, wrote it down, not to memorize. Most of us sound terrible when we memorize. We're not actors, but to know your key points in order, but to be sure that your key points includes either the result or outcome, or what I learned was da da da. And again, practicing out loud is key. One use of ChatGPT that I really love is you can manually take the job ad and read, okay, prepare, design marketing strategy for vacuum cleaner, new product, issues. Okay, that's in the job ad. And you could create an interview question to address that, right? Tell me about your experience with designing marketing strategies for new vacuum cleaner products. You could do that manually for everything in the job ad, but you can plug it into ChatGPT and say, here's a job ad. Please design interview questions to address this job ad. And ChatGPT can do a good job on that, and can do it faster. You and I could do a good job too, but it's a bit laborious, right, to craft that question. But they give you the prompt questions and then you practice them. And of course, you're also going to prepare the behavioral interview stories. Tell me about a time when you disagreed with your boss, you failed, you overcame a challenge, all the different, and you can find lists online. And again, good resources on our website as well. Preparing references. Ideally, you want to have an actual conversation by phone or Zoom with your reference so that you can talk together about how they're going to discuss your strengths and a possible weakness for specific jobs. That may not always be, I know it's hard to do, emotionally sometimes to sort of bring these things up with your former supervisors, your references, but you definitely want to give them a heads up with what the job is, and create in terms of giving, so that to give information about the job to the reference so that they're prepared, and then creating a list of your references with how they can be contacted, how they, what their role was connected with you, but you don't share it until you're asked. So before we jump into the main job search methods, more questions, Nicole?
I'm scrolling through and I don't see any more questions. I see a lot of great suggestions and recommendations. So what I'm thinking is,
call out one or two.
So we have earnbetter.com. I love this suggestion from Michael, which is he recently joined a job search council via the Never Search Alone community. And he puts the link in www.phyl.org. I think having a group, almost like I think like having an accountability partner or a partner, who's also in a job search is useful. So, I haven't looked at the Never Search Alone community. I'm definitely going to check that out.
Thank you for those resources.
Great. We do have a couple of other, let's see, questions. I would love to hear some strategies for how to bypass applicant tracking systems and get noticed by actual humans at potential jobs.
Okay, great question. We will get into that, but the short answer is really networking and targeting the people in the departments you want to work at, or at least, or a Tufts alum, even if they're at a different part of the company. Someone was telling me just yesterday of a story of how they connected with a Tufts alum who was in a completely different department of a pretty good sized company. And she introduced him to somebody who's in the right department. So at least he has that contact. So when I have time, or if it's a live in-person workshop, it's great to ask, what percentage, sometimes we ask it as what percentage of job seekers do you think find opportunities with each of these, find their job with each of these methods. Other times I've seen it done with a live audience of 100 people, asking people, how did you get your last job? Was it responding to a job ad? Was it targeted mailing, which is basically where you write to the person you want to work for, even when they're not advertising for you, not for anybody? Was it a recruiter, search firm, the outside recruiter, external recruiter? Was it networking? And what was so great was, this was a few years back, Nicole. I don't know if you were at this one with Dan King. When he, there were hands that were going up with the different methods, but when he said the word networking, a forest of hands went up. It was at least 60, 65% of the people there. And there was an audible gasp. People went, oh, there was just like this reaction. It was so great. And that's the sort of short answer here. Yes, you can respond to job ads. And they are out there. And yes, it can feel frustrating when you see a job ad, say on LinkedIn, and you can see, sometimes it will tell you how many people are applying. I always tell people, don't look at that. Don't give yourself that. Targeted mailing. So responding to job ads, is it 20% of people find jobs that way? Is it 30? It depends on your industry and your field, because targeted mailing is going to be a small percentage of success. Overall, surveys say maybe it's 5% of people land jobs that way, where you email someone directly that you want to work for and they're not advertising, and you tell them, here's what I can do for you. Right. They have to have the need. So is it always going to work for everyone? No, but it's something to know about and have in your toolkit. Recruiters, search firms, headhunters is a great example of, in my experience, working primarily for nonprofits, large and small, at a professional level, not at a senior executive level. Recruiters have been 0% for me. Effectiveness they don't operate in the spheres that I work in. But for you, your mileage might be very different, right? It could be in some technical fields or professional fields, 30% of position people find jobs through a recruiter, or 20%, right? Whereas networking, we know, is the big kahuna, the big effective method. And it can be combined with other things, right? You might, especially you see a job ad, you can apply to it, but you can also go to work with the networking, with the developing your network to see if you can get information or ideally an introduction or an inside contact at that company to speak with you. So the reason I spend some time with this is because the reason it's important to think about this is you want to proportion your time according to the effectiveness of the method for you. And that takes some real discipline, because what happens to the job ads, right? The job ads, there are lots of them out there, or there may be in your field many. It can feel like you can get sucked into spending all of your time applying online and not pursuing any of the other methods, especially networking. And that's a big mistake. So, of course, LinkedIn has jobs, Indeed has jobs, and there may be professional association or industry websites that have job listings for you. They are very effective as research, as job market indicators. Yes, you can apply to them, but don't spend more time on it than its effectiveness for you, right, in your field, your industry. How do you respond to job ads? Again, we talked about this, the cover letter customized, ideally, or if appropriate for your industry, your sector. Follow the application instructions precisely, and then look for the ways to stand out, which could be writing directly to the hiring manager, if you can figure out who it is, right? If it says reports to the deputy division head of Eastern region, blah, 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 right? Then you can look up on LinkedIn to find out deputy division head of Eastern region, right? And you can figure out who it is, and you can send them an email saying, I applied online for the such and such role, but wanted to write to you directly. And then the rest of it, of the email, is your cover letter. When you attach your resume, does it always work? No, but sometimes. Of course, talking to people in the department, the company, the industry, that networking piece. Ideal world, you get a referral in or an introduction into that department or to that manager. Now, showing up in person, I mentioned it. It's something to think about if it's appropriate for your industry, for your sector. There are some, like hospital, hospital inpatient units that are absolutely, you would never want to do that. There are others, such as, a small company or a nonprofit type of setting. Maybe it is okay to show up and have a copy of your resume and cover letter in an envelope and say, I'm interested in such and such. What do you think? Other thoughts, Nicole, on standing out in the hiring application process?
Well, I always say, the direct application isn't enough. So you need to be looking on LinkedIn to see who you can find. And if you're talking to people on LinkedIn and doing your research prior to the cover letter phase, that's really going to help. So I think standing out is showing in a cover letter that you've gone beyond just looking at their website, that you're talking to people.
Right.
So
good point. Targeted mailing, we mentioned that briefly. That's where you design a letter, an email really, with the attached resume for the job you wish they were advertising. Here's how I can help you. Again, speaking to a pain point. You don't want to spend all your time target mailing employers that are not advertising, but I just want you to have that in your toolkit. That's one of those proactive things you can do. Your ideal job and company, that's where you have that one place that you would absolutely love to work. You can put a little more time into your research. Customers, competitors, vendors, suppliers, employees, so that you can make your best possible pitch. But again, you don't want to spend 100% of your time on one ideal company, but definitely can be in there. Now, recruiters, again, for some of us, it won't be a factor because of the industry or the sector or the level that you're in, but in others, it can be a good source of industry trend and salary info. Can extend your reach into more companies. Just remember who they work for, not you. They work for the company. They're paid by the company. There's a little more detail about just being how to get referrals, asking your contacts or people in your network or that you meet about recruiters that they have used personally. Follow the money, meaning if they've personally paid a recruiter to get staff for their team, right? They know if they're effective. Now, networking. We've talked about it, how it can help you with the jobs that are advertised, right? When you're reaching out to Tufts alumni or people in your network on LinkedIn to ask for a conversation so you can learn more about the opportunity, about the company. But most jobs are not advertised yet, right? Some are not advertised ever. But the ones that aren't advertised yet, if you think about it, if you've been in the working world for a while, you know there's a time lag from when the manager and people on the team know that they need somebody, but it isn't officially posted yet, or it isn't advertised widely. And other times they have an emerging need and they're putting out the word through their networks. People hire people, not resumes. And when you're out there talking to people in your target industry, target areas, you're learning a lot. You're practicing telling some of your stories. And so sometimes you're learning about everything from, the skills you could be polishing, right? The companies or areas you could be researching, as well as about that specific company. We're doing on time. Yeah. Lots of different ways to network. I've talked about informational interviews where you ask someone for, a 25-minute meeting to ask them questions about their role, their industry, their company. Business events or professional association events are excellent ways to learn and connect with people. Some fields, there's a lot of groups or ways to connect on social media, see what's appropriate for your industry, your sector. And in terms of informational interviews, we have a terrific resource called The Herd, easily findable on our website. And The Herd is just Tufts alumni and students. It's Art Sciences and Engineering SMFA, right, Nicole? Mm-hmm. For The Herd? Yeah, mm-hmm. For The Herd. And it's a smaller group than LinkedIn, but they've already volunteered. So check it out if that fits your situation. We talked about LinkedIn. The Tufts online community is alumni and alumni directory, and it has alumni emails if Tufts has the knowledge of the email, right? So not everyone is in there, but the emails are only as up to date as the humans have updated them. But email is sometimes what I recommend, and there's more than one way to approach this, is you could do your first outreach through LinkedIn with a request to connect to a Tufts alum. And then if you don't hear back right away, you could go to the online community and get a direct email. I've had other people I've worked with who say they prefer to start with the direct email and then connect on LinkedIn after. The nice thing about LinkedIn, though, is if they do click on it, you're right there. They can see information about you right away. Again, professional associations, great way to meet people or use the membership list to connect with people in your industry. And then don't forget, your family and the other people in other groups that you're part of, they may have connections that can be helpful, that they can introduce you to. We talked about why, that you're learning more about your area of interest, the trends, and potential to earn referrals, right? Either a direct referral for a specific job or an introduction to another contact. And getting advice, right? What meetings or conferences should I be checking out? What recruiters could I use, right? All of those things. We're running close to the end of time where I wanted to really have time for more Q&A. But
we do have questions. We do have questions that have come in. So you tell us what you want to do. Take questions or sort of continue.
Just highlight this, that there's information about networking at meetings and conferences. There's a good book in the resources, Make Your Contacts Count, which is listed in the resources, which is very helpful about preparing for meetings and conferences and sort of networking for life. Okay. So questions. Let's take that.
Right. So first question is, someone asked, are you going to provide all of these links in the, that we're putting into the chat? Yes, we will I will send out an email after the webinar with the PowerPoint attached, and then I'll categorize all of these different links. We've had so many questions in the chat, and we've also again had some great recommendations, so I will include those. So I think one question that came up was, how does one handle a long career of references? Like, do you categorize?
Meaning you have like a 20+ year career and you have references from all the different jobs and time periods? Do you think that's what the person means? Yeah. Well, think relevance. When you're interviewing for a specific opportunity, think, which of my references can speak to the skills and problem-solving ability and industry knowledge, right? Which of the references they're going to want something recent. They're generally going to want to speak to your current or recent manager. And other than that, I'd say relevance to exactly what you'll be doing in the new job. What do you think, Nicole? Anything to add?
I think absolutely relevance.
You
I mean,
you won't give them 20. Yeah, you won't give them a list of 20.
No. But I think, stick to the number that they ask for. Don't offer more, and prioritize them in the order that you would want them contacted in case they don't contact all of them. And I would try to, pick ones that are relatively more recent. I think something 20 years ago, I think that's, I would stick to, because what you're doing now most recently, or the skills that you've gained or how you've progressed, I think that's more relevant maybe. And there are probably exceptions to that. So yeah. So someone writes, I've been advised to focus only on the last 15 years of experience, summarize any older experience under a brief heading of additional experience. That's for a
resume. That's a resume approach. And you'll see, if you look at sample resumes from your public library or Amazon, if you give your sort of 15-ish years of recent experience, and then you can say prior experience includes. And then, so for example, my prior experience includes on my resume, I don't put the company names because the older companies are not name recognition companies. I say, career counseling roles and training roles at small nonprofits in the Boston area, right, for example. Or good. Another question?
Another question is, in regards to age discrimination, how common is it? How does one rise above it? And what is the actual concern around end of career workers that fuels the discrimination?
Wow, that could be a half-day workshop right there.
Right.
The age discrimination exists. It's real. It's worse. It's better. I would say it's better in some industries and some sectors than other. I've heard anecdotally that the federal government, for example, is less biased about age. Anecdotal, not fact necessarily. Part of it is, it still comes down to, can you solve the problem that they have? Can you add value, create what they need created, solve the problem that they have, and then being able to show that in your resume, in your preparation and research before the interview. That's what it really comes down to, and being able to demonstrate that with past work samples, and I think it's helpful to talk to people, network with people in your target industry, target job function area, not necessarily, to ask the question in sort of a tactful way, like how do they see workers of different generations, different ages, valued in their workplace? Do they have advice for you about how to sort of demonstrate your currentness, your up-to-dateness? Do you have something to add, Nicole, about? It's a big question.
I think identifying companies and organizations that are known for hiring people across the sort of age and career phase. Don't shoot me for this, but AARP has great resources. Job and career resources, Encore Career.
Yes. And they're not just about retiring. That's a great point.
No, right,
There,
right.
there's a lot about work and
Yeah.
career. Mhm.
So another question we have is, and I really am trying to get to all of these
Mhm.
in the
Yeah,
order that they're being asked. But
sure.
if you've asked more than one question, I think I'm going to look at some of the folks who I haven't responded to. Um, Here's from Constance. How important is the internal referral?
Uh, that is a great it depends question. If you mean by internal referral the being part of an official, database, company managed process where you know, they're putting a special mark next to your name and your resume gets put into a special bucket where it gets at least it's more likely that a human being looks at it. The answer is it depends on the company, right? It's always helpful because it always increases your chances of a human being looking at your resume ever at all, right? Um, and some companies, and on the other sense, if you use employee referral in a more broad term as just making a contact at the company, getting a connection at the company, getting their advice, and then potentially having them. I've certainly had it happen where somebody says, "Oh, my favorite example was someone using finding a Tufts alum in the Career Network, our older version of the herd, and said, I've applied for this job as a production coordinator at this publishing company. And the person said, that's my old job. I left last month. They had a great conversation. She introduced her to her former boss. She did end up getting the job. So that was what I would call an informal referral. Some companies hire a very high percentage of their staff through employee referrals, either formal or informal. Other companies know that while that's a great source of people, it also tends to reinforce same hiring, same. Um, any additional thoughts, Nicole, about how important the employee referral is?
Oh, I think it's absolutely important, and I think that's why we're networking.
Right.
But yes, I think that the concept of having resumes on file or having resumes in an applicant tracking system, we see this in higher ed where
Mm-hmm.
we have a job that we're hiring for, and human resources will, if they have great resumes that they've identified,
Mm-hmm.
for from people who have applied for other jobs but didn't make that, but they really like that person, they'll
Mm-hmm.
often send those to us to say, here are a few more that we had in our system. So,
Right.
and yeah, so
So that can help too.
yeah.
Good.
Um,
Other questions?
another couple of questions that are somewhat related.
Mm-hmm.
Um, any recommendations for finding remote jobs?
Yeah.
And then a question that's somewhat related to that is, what about applying to hybrid roles in another state? My experience is there is an AI bot block on those resumes because they don't want to deal with relocations, etc. Even if you have the ability to make it work, how do you get past that? So I think, this,
Wow.
yeah, so somewhat
Yeah.
related, sort of like
Yeah. Yeah.
remote jobs
Well,
recommendations, but then also how do you,
hybrid.
if there's a hybrid role, and clearly a lot of these roles that are hybrid are saying we'll only hire from these 5 states,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of them are, I'll touch just that one first. Yeah. Some of them are very specific, or will say, and I like it when they do this, where they say, you must be on site at work 2 days per week, or you must be on site, 1 day per week, or whatever it is, or we'll say specific months. But for the one where you can commute to that other state 2 days a week, you have a place to stay, you have a way to make it work, whatever it is, that is very tough. Yeah, if they are literally blocking out the resumes that aren't from certain states, it comes down to two things. One, the big one really would be the networking, talking to people on the inside. Are there ever exceptions? How do people get considered um, to be an exception? Um, The other thing that I've seen people do, which I have a mixed feeling about, is you find a friend and you use their address. In other words, a friend in the target city or target state. Um, the problem with doing that is, of course, you're not being truthful, and you're going to need to be open about where you're physically located at some point in the interview process. The one time when I feel like that's okay is, let's say you're planning a move to New York City from Washington, D.C. You've already committed to the move, it's happening in 2 months. To me, it's okay if you say New York City on your resume while you're in the packing and prepping for that move stage, because you will be there. But I don't know. Did you have a thought about that, Nicole? I think if they're really blocking the zip codes or the states, you just have to network, right?
I tend to say stick with the rules. I mean, I wouldn't want you to go down a
Yeah,
path and put in a whole lot of effort, and then it turns out that, when they're
mhm.
verifying, doing whatever
No,
they need
no,
to do for a background check, or
yeah,
that is found out.
yeah,
So
no,
I think
no,
about it in terms of effort,
yeah.
put in.
Put in your effort. The question about finding remote roles, though, some for the advertised job world, some of them are very clear and well delineated, and you can put that in your search factors for LinkedIn or other job boards that you want remote roles. Um, so that's sort of the best way in terms of the ones that are advertised. Sometimes you can also Google and find lists of companies with 100% remote jobs, or you can also, and also the networking process when you're targeting a certain industry niche or sector, talking to people about advice about companies that are 100% remote. Other thoughts, Nicole, about identifying remote?
Remote. Well, Joshua, as Joshua says, there are dozens of remote job boards now.
Yeah.
So, but I think talking to people who are remote and how they found their job, and
Mm-hmm.
that's harder to find those people, on LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have, Joshua's adding some in here. Thank you, Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just about keyword search, right? Put in remote jobs. Um,
But I'm talking about,
so
something broader. It may be that the company isn't advertising for you right now, but you still want to identify some target companies, right?
mhm,
That are, and
right.
that's what I'm saying, looking for Googling for lists, and knowing,
Mhm,
though, companies change their policies, right?
mhm.
Yeah.
I
Other,
think,
now we're,
we're at 2:03. So I
yeah.
think I wanted to, sort of ask you one more question for those who,
Okay.
because we still have 49 people on. Um, and this is
Mhm.
sort of a very common question. Any suggestion for getting Tufts alumni at a target company to actually respond to you?
Yes. Thank you for that question. Um, you, for most Tufts alumni at most levels in most organizations, they're going to be comfortable with you reaching out with a request to connect with a customized note explaining, and we have information about this on our website under networking, about that you would like to speak to them and why. Um, and again, they may or may not respond. Back to the herd, right? The herd people have already volunteered. So if your target company has some people in it, or your target industry or job function in the herd, they've already volunteered. We have a really good response rate, I'd say, right, Nicole?
Hmm.
With the herd
Right.
request.
And I put in the chat the link to
Mhm.
all of the Tufts schools career websites in which
Mhm.
they all have their own online communities,
Mhm.
so dental or Fletcher and I
Mhm.
think that, whether those are on LinkedIn or it's some other platform, dental and Fletcher are two that have, they also have their own, platform, but
Mhm.
um, it's that same, notion that the folks have signed up to be a part of that,
Right.
whether it's a LinkedIn group or
Right.
it's, some kind of a, a group that,
Mhm.
the professional or graduate school is cultivating, that those are folks who are stepping up, right?
Right.
Um,
And another, yeah, and then just to reiterate, if you reach out through LinkedIn to a Tufts alum with that, introducing yourself and asking for to speak to them about their career, their company, um, then you can follow up with direct email. And some people, and that definitely increases your hit rate of getting a meeting, because then either they notice it twice, or maybe they missed the LinkedIn message, but now
Mm-hmm.
they see an email with that targeted subject line, Tufts grad or fellow jumbo with New York City equity research career questions, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is. The specific, is it, Wayfair career questions? Is it software engineering at Amazon career
Mm-hmm.
questions? What, and you put your major in your subject line if you have the same major as the person. Don't put your major if you don't, right? You're looking for that subject line to get noticed. Tufts grad, jumbo.
Right.
If their email isn't in or isn't updated in the alumni directory, which can happen, there's a resource called hunter.io. Hunter.io is an email pattern finder. So you put in the URL of the company to hunter.io, and it says, we found 280 examples on the web. The email pattern is first initial dot last name at fidelity.com or wayfair.com, whatever it is. Now, caveat on that, it doesn't work necessarily with the big tech giants, because they may have more than one way of doing their email patterns. And and universities, government entities and universities usually have directories where you can find staff emails. But most other organizations do not. But that's what I'd say. People, and again, for samples of how to write those appeal, that request introduction, you can find them online. You can find them on our website. Is that it for the questions for now? Should I wrap up? I
Let's
know.
see. So let me go through because there were some others, but I did want to mention about LinkedIn. So I think
Mhm.
there's LinkedIn fatigue,
Yeah.
and so I would try more than once, reach
Mhm.
out a week or, a week and a half, 2 weeks later. And there's sort of that difference with some people, a lot of people are looking at LinkedIn on their mobile phone.
Mhm.
So they're not paying as close attention. They might, if you're asking a question, if you're asking, if requesting you know, a career conversation through the invitation to connect,
Mhm.
a lot, some people are just going to connect with you, accept you, but they might not read that, read that message.
Good point.
So I think, go back through and see, like, okay, this person accepted, they didn't respond to whether or not they'd be open to a career conversation, but then reach out to them again and say, hey, thanks for connecting. Would you
Mhm.
be open to a career conversation?
Mhm.
Um, I think another way you had mentioned, like, oh, mention your major, mention your year of graduation if you graduated around that same time. And that
Mhm.
could be something that could help with ageism. Um, let's see, I feel like there were a couple more. Let me see. And I think also on LinkedIn, um, the looking to see who you have common connections and asking for an intro. I mean,
Yeah.
that's how you're going to get them to respond, and we don't always know those people who we have in common. But if someone's a good friend with someone else and they're introducing you, then
Right.
it's probably
Thank
it's
you.
gonna happen. So that's really what networking is, right? Is
Yeah.
taking advantage of your first level connections to get to your second level connections.
Thank
Um,
you for reminding us about that, Nicole. That in the second level connections also is a way to then it may be that you look at the list of folks in that company and you see a second level connection has nothing to do with Tufts, but you know the person
right,
well. So you can say, oh, Nicole, I see you know so and so.
right.
Do you know her well enough to introduce me? I'd love to learn
Hmm.
more about Wayfair, where she's
Yeah,
working.
yeah.
Yeah, that's another.
Another question, I find it hard to network since I don't want my coworkers to know I'm looking for a job. And I wonder about word getting back. You never know who knows who. How do you network without letting your coworkers know you are looking?
Oh, that's such a great question. And this is where, it really, in some ways, it depends how small a world you're in. If it's a very, very small niche industry or world, you do need to be prepared for if you start talking to people um, the word may get back, but otherwise you can, you can be thoughtful and choiceful about who you reach out to, right? And you'll be able to see, for at least LinkedIn will tell you, oh, if this person you're looking at is listed as a connection of somebody at your company, right? Maybe they know each other well. You can always ask people, tell them that you're exploring confidentially for now, and
Mhm.
ask people to hold the confidentiality. And when you're doing something like being in a professional association, that's a great example of where you may be more discreet and maybe developing relationships, but not necessarily standing up in the meeting saying, I'd love to meet people who are doing robot vacuums and, in every,
Mhm.
but yeah, you do, there is some risk when you start talking to new people, that is true, but you can at least minimize it by thinking about who you're speaking to and where and who they're connected to. Anything to add, Nicole, or?
Um, no, I'll, ditto what you just said.
Mhm.
I think maybe one other question, going back to ageism,
Mhm.
someone asked, is there a way I can cheat my resume to not give away my age?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You can list, the most recent 15 years of experience. Some people don't even put the prior experience includes phrase in there, although I don't agree with that. I feel more comfortable putting that phrase in there. You don't have to put your years of graduation from your school programs on a resume, although some companies will have an online form that you fill out where you do need to fill in your years of graduation. Yeah, you can definitely conceal age on a resume, and that's okay to do. I just don't lie. Don't
Mhm.
misrepresent the truth.
Right. So I think I may have touched upon all of the, if not the questions, the topics that
Okay.
were asked.
So we want to acknowledge people for sticking around beyond our time. Just the final wrap up tips is using all of the job search methods that are appropriate for um, your field, your industry. Be sure to get support. Take some risks, but manageable risks. And when we say ask for advice, not a job, we mean these career conversations, right? You're not saying, Nicole, great to talk to you. Can you hire me for your team? Do you have this job is open? Can you hire me? Right? We want to say, Nicole, can you share information about your team and acknowledge, yes, I'm applying and I'm interested in your team, but want to talk to you for advice. And keep up your momentum. And then some of these resources, the ones that I wanted to call out is I did put some recent articles about ChatGPT and using it in job search and career exploration. Um, and again, look for fresh articles as well as these are fresh now, but if you're looking 6 months down the line, look and see what's new. Lots of the things you have, there's lots of mindfulness resources that I added. And a lot of not all, but some of the questions, many of the questions that people have been raising in the chat, you really can find thoughtful, good articles about online. So definitely check our website for resources in your areas of interest, but also we look forward to seeing you in a future meeting, future webinar.
And we do have many webinars, events coming up, new content. So please look at the Alumni and Friends event calendar. Um, I put the link in the chat, but I will put it in the email that I'm going to send to everyone. We have a great webinar about dealing with, dealing with conflict intentionally. We have a sort of a career search webinar coming up, the impact of what impacts you. And both of those are led by coaches. Leslie and I are trying something new where we're going to do a full hour of, it's called Ask the Career Coach. Those will be coming up. So it'll be kind of like this with,
With no
raising your
PowerPoint.
hand. Right. And no PowerPoint. It'll just be asking us questions for an hour. And then we have so many events happening around the country too. Networking events. Some of them are just social. Some of them are sort of based on an industry group. So the calendar is great. look at that. And yeah, I think that's about it for today. We covered a lot. Leslie,
Mm.
thank you so much, Leslie, for um, guiding us through this, the job search, and we wish everyone the best of luck. Happy New Year, and in this new year, we want to help you get to that next step. So thanks again.
Thanks for joining us.